Coming up next, Annoying Orange on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Adventure Time on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Adventure Time Steaks on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Apple and Onion on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Ben 10 Omniverse on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Beyblade Metal Masters on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Beyblade Metal Masters on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Bay Warriors Bay Raiders on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Codename Kids Next Door. Later, What's New, Scooby-Doo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Dragon Ball Z on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Garage Band on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, The Amazing World of Gumball on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Incredible Crew on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Incredible Crew on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Johnny Test. Later, The Amazing World of Gumball on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Johnny Test on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Mad on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Mau Mau Heroes of Pure Heart on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, more Mau Mau Heroes of Pure Heart. Later, a new Ninjago on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Cartoon Network's Movieverse on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, a new Ninjago. Later, the new series Steven Universe on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, the new series Steven Universe. Later, Cartoon Planet on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Ninjago on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, OKKO, Let's Be Heroes on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Over the Garden Wall on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Pokemon on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Powerpuff Girls Z on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Regular Show on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Scooby-Doo and Arabian Nights on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, What's New, Scooby-Doo? Later, Incredible Crew on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Later, Cartoon Network's Movieverse on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Total Drama World Tour on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Teen Titans Go on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Uncle Grandpa on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Young Justice on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Tom and Jerry on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, We Bare Bears on Cartoon Network.